The elevator doors slid open with a metallic whisper, revealing Marcus Wellington in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, yet looked deliberately unremarkable. The 52-year-old tech mogul adjusted his worn baseball cap and stepped into the marble lobby of Pinnacle Financial Services, the very investment firm he'd built from nothing 23 years ago. Today, however, nobody would recognize him as the man whose signature graced their paychecks. The security guard barely glanced up from his newspaper, and the receptionist continued her phone conversation about weekend plans, oblivious to the fact that their boss stood 3 feet away, invisible in plain sight. Marcus had spent months planning this moment. The idea had crystallized during a sleepless night 6 weeks earlier, when his daughter Zoe had called him crying from her freshman dorm at Columbia. She'd overheard her roommate's father, a Pinnacle client, making casual remarks about those people and their supposed inability to handle wealth responsibly. The conversation had cut deeper than any business setback Marcus had ever faced, because it revealed a truth he'd been avoiding for decades. Success had insulated him from the very prejudices that had shaped his journey, but it hadn't eliminated them. They'd simply learned to hide behind polished smiles and corporate courtesy. If you've ever wondered what really happens when privilege thinks nobody's watching, consider subscribing, because the next few minutes will change how you see everything. The morning air conditioning hummed with an expensive whisper as Marcus approached the reception desk, his weathered sneakers silent against the polished marble. He'd practiced this moment, rehearsing the slight stoop in his shoulders, the hesitant way he'd clear his throat, the careful modulation of his voice to match the assumptions people would make about a middle-aged black man in thrift store clothes seeking financial advice. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, whose nameplate gleamed under the crystal chandelier, finally looked up with the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone carrying the subtle weight of someone already calculating how quickly this interaction could be concluded. "Yes, ma'am. I was hoping to speak with someone about investment opportunities. I've come into a small inheritance, and I want to make sure I handle it properly." Marcus kept his voice soft, respectful, tinged with the kind of uncertainty that would make him seem harmless and, more importantly, unprofitable. Ashley's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, ma'am. I was hoping someone might have a few minutes. I know it's not much money, probably not what you folks usually deal with, but it's everything to me." The pause that followed stretched like a held breath. Marcus watched Ashley's eyes perform a quick assessment, taking in his faded jeans, the small tear near his left knee, the generic polo shirt he'd bought specifically for this charade. He could almost see her mental calculations, weighing the cost of her time against the likelihood of a meaningful commission. "Well, our advisors are quite busy today," she said, glancing at her computer screen with theatrical concern. "What kind of amount are we discussing?" "About $50,000, Marcus replied, naming a sum that was simultaneously substantial for most people and negligible for a firm that regularly managed 8-figure portfolios. Ashley's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy if it weren't so obviously practiced. "I see. Well, Mr. Johnson, Marcus Johnson. Mr. Johnson, our minimum for new client consultations is typically much higher. However, I could put you in touch with our community outreach coordinator. She handles our financial literacy programs." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Financial literacy programs. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger exactly, but a familiar weight he'd carried since childhood in Detroit, when teachers would automatically place him in remedial classes despite his straight A's, when bank tellers would scrutinize his mother's checks with suspicious intensity, when college counselors would steer him toward more realistic career paths. "I appreciate that," Marcus said carefully, "but I was really hoping to speak with an actual advisor. This inheritance, it's from my grandmother, And she always said I should be smart about money. I've been reading about investments, trying to educate myself." Ashley's fingers drummed against her desk, a soft percussion that seemed to mark time while she decided how much effort this conversation deserved. Behind her, the office buzzed with the quiet energy of serious money being moved and managed. Marcus could see through the glass partition into the main floor, where his employees, people he'd hired and mentored and trusted, went about their daily routines. Sarah Chen was explaining something to a client, her hands moving in animated gestures. David Rodriguez was on the phone, probably closing another deal. Jennifer Walsh was reviewing documents, her red pen moving with surgical precision. "Let me check if anyone has a cancellation," Ashley said finally, her tone suggesting this was an extraordinary favor. She picked up her phone and dialed an extension, turning slightly away as if to create privacy for a conversation that Marcus, as the actual owner of the company, had every right to hear. "Hi, it's Ashley. I have a gentleman here, Marcus Johnson, looking for investment advice. 50,000 inheritance." She paused, listening. "Yes, I know. I told him about the community programs, but he's insisting." Another pause. "Okay, I'll see." She hung up and turned back to Marcus with a smile that had grown even thinner. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, but our advisors are completely booked today. However, I can schedule you for next Thursday with Janet Morrison. She's excellent with smaller portfolios." Marcus knew Janet Morrison. He'd hired her himself 3 years ago, impressed by her credentials and her passion for democratizing financial planning. What he didn't know was how she'd respond to a potential client who looked like him and claimed resources that seemed modest by Pinnacle's standards. "Next Thursday would be wonderful," Marcus said. "What time?" "How about 4:30? It's our last appointment slot of the day." The last slot, when the important clients were gone, when the office was winding down, when a meeting could be cut short without disrupting the real business of the day. Marcus nodded and provided a phone number, one of several he maintained for various business purposes, this one registered to a Marcus Johnson in a modest apartment across town. As he turned to leave, Marcus caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished elevator doors. The man staring back looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of pretense had added years to his face. But there was something else in his eyes, a spark of determination that reminded him why he was doing this. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and as the doors closed behind him, Marcus heard Ashley's voice drifting across the lobby. "Can you believe that? 50,000 and he wants a full consultation. Some people just don't understand how this business works." The week that followed moved with the strange, suspended quality of a held breath. Marcus went about his regular routine, attending board meetings via video conference from his home office, reviewing quarterly reports, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and thousands of clients. But underneath the familiar rhythms of his daily life, something new was growing, a restless energy, an anticipation that felt both exciting and deeply unsettling. He found himself studying his own company with fresh eyes, noticing things that had become invisible through familiarity. The way the marketing materials featured diverse faces, but somehow managed to convey an unmistakable message about who truly belonged in their world. The subtle hierarchies that determined which clients got corner offices for their meetings and which got the smaller conference rooms near the break area. The unspoken understanding that certain types of wealth were more welcome than others. On Tuesday evening, Marcus sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his success. Awards lined the walls. Photographs captured handshakes with politicians and celebrities. And through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled like a circuit board against the darkness. His wife Elena found him there, staring at a framed article from Forbes that had featured him in their Self-Made Billionaires issue 5 years earlier. "You've been quiet lately," she said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. After 28 years of marriage, Eleanor could read his moods like weather patterns, sensing storms long before they broke. Am I just thinking about the business? Marcus replied, which was true enough, though incomplete. The same business that's been thriving for over 2 decades. The one that just posted record profits? Elena's voice carried the gentle skepticism of someone who knew when she wasn't getting the whole story. Marcus set down the magazine and looked at his wife, really looked at her. Elena Rodriguez Wellington had been his anchor through every challenge, every triumph, every moment of doubt. She'd stood beside him when he was a young programmer with big dreams and a small bank account, and she'd celebrated with him when those dreams became reality. But even she, with all her wisdom and love, couldn't fully understand the weight he carried as one of the few black billionaires in America, the constant awareness that his success was seen by some as an exception rather than an achievement. "Do you remember when we first started the company?" Marcus asked. "And how hard it was to get that initial funding?" Elena smiled, though her eyes remained concerned. 27 rejections before someone finally said yes. You kept a list. I still have that list. 27 investors who couldn't see past their assumptions long enough to recognize a good opportunity. Marcus picked up a paperweight from his desk, a smooth piece of obsidian that Elena had given him for luck during those early days. "I used to think that once we proved ourselves, once we became successful, that would change things. That success would make us invisible in the best way, judged only by our results. And it has changed things," Elena said softly. "Look what you've built. Look at the lives you've changed, the opportunities you've created. But what if it's only changed for us? What if the same prejudices are still there, just hidden better?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying her husband's face. "What are you planning, Marcus?" He told her about Zoe's phone call, about the comments that had shattered his daughter's faith in the world they'd worked so hard to build for her. He explained his decision to visit Pinnacle as Marcus Johnson, to see his own company through the eyes of someone who looked like him but lacked his resources and reputation. "And what do you hope to accomplish?" Elena asked when he finished. "I want to know the truth. Not the polished version we present to the world, not the diversity statistics we include in our annual reports, but the real truth about who we serve and how we serve them." Elena reached across the desk and took his hand. "And if the truth is ugly, then we fix it. We do better. We become the company I thought we already were." Thursday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made the city look like a postcard. Marcus dressed carefully in the same clothes he'd worn the previous week, adding a few strategic wrinkles and a coffee stain on his sleeve that he'd practiced making look accidental. He took the subway instead of his usual car service, standing among the commuters and construction workers and students, remembering a version of himself that had ridden these same trains with dreams bigger than his bank account. The Pinnacle building rose before him like a monument to ambition, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun in brilliant fragments. Marcus paused on the sidewalk, watching the stream of employees and clients flowing through the revolving doors. He recognized several faces, people he'd worked with for years, people who knew him as a leader and visionary. Today, he would discover if they knew him as a human being. Ashley was at her post behind the reception desk, looking polished and professional in a way that suggested she took pride in being the first impression of the company. She looked up as Marcus approached, and he watched her face cycle through a moment of non-recognition before settling into the same careful courtesy she'd shown him the previous week. "Mr. Johnson," she said with a smile that seemed marginally warmer than before. "Right on time for your appointment with Janet." "Yes, ma'am, I'm looking forward to it." Ashley picked up her phone and dialed an extension. "Janet, your 4:30 is here." A pause. "Yes, Mr. Johnson." Another pause, longer this time. "And okay, I'll send him back." She hung up and gestured toward the hallway that led to the advisor offices. "Conference room 3. Janet will be right with you." Marcus walked down the familiar corridor, past offices where he'd celebrated promotions and consoled employees through difficult times, past conference rooms where he'd made decisions that shaped the company's future. Conference Room 3 was one of the smaller spaces, adequate but unremarkable, with a view of the building's air conditioning units rather than the city skyline. He was studying the generic motivational posters on the walls when Janet Morrison knocked and entered. Marcus had always liked Janet, a woman in her early 40s with an infectious enthusiasm for financial planning and a genuine desire to help people achieve their goals. She'd been one of his best hires, someone who understood that wealth building was about more than numbers, that it was about dreams and security and the freedom to choose your own path. "Mr. Johnson," Janet said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "I'm Janet Morrison. Please have a seat." Marcus shook her hand and settled into one of the conference room chairs, noting how Janet positioned herself across the table rather than beside him, maintaining a professional distance that felt somehow more pronounced than necessary. "And so," Janet said, opening a leather portfolio and clicking her pen, "Ashley mentioned you've come into an inheritance and you're looking for investment advice. That's wonderful. It shows real wisdom to seek professional guidance." The tone was warm, but carried an undertone that Marcus recognized, the slightly elevated speech pattern people sometimes used when they assumed they were talking to someone less educated or sophisticated. It wasn't malicious, perhaps not even conscious, but it was unmistakably there. "Yes, ma'am. My grandmother passed 6 months ago, and she left me $50,000. She always said I should be smart with money, not just spend it on things I don't need." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Janet said, making a note in her portfolio. 50,000 is a significant amount, and there are definitely strategies we can explore to help it grow over time. Marcus watched Janet's pen move across the paper, noting how she wrote 50K inheritance, with an efficiency that suggested this was a routine consultation rather than a meaningful opportunity. He'd seen Janet work with major clients, watched her prepare detailed presentations and comprehensive financial plans. This felt different, more perfunctory. "I've been reading about different types of investments," Marcus continued. "Stocks, bonds, mutual funds. I want to understand my options." "That's great that you're educating yourself," Janet replied, her tone carrying the subtle condescension of someone praising a child for trying. "And financial literacy is so important, especially in communities that haven't traditionally had access to these kinds of opportunities." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed assumptions that Janet probably didn't even realize she was making. Communities that haven't traditionally had access. As if his presence in this office was somehow remarkable, as if his desire to invest wisely was unexpected rather than natural. "What would you recommend for someone in my situation?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice level despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Janet consulted her notes and then looked up with a practiced smile. "Well, given the amount we're working with and your experience level, I'd suggest starting with something conservative and straightforward. Maybe a balanced mutual fund, something with a mix of stocks and bonds that won't require a lot of monitoring on your part." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd watched Janet present investment strategies to other clients, seen her recommend aggressive growth portfolios and sophisticated instruments to people with similar or even smaller amounts to invest. The difference was that those clients had been white, well-dressed, and presumed to have financial sophistication. "What about individual stocks?" Marcus asked. "I've been following some technology companies that seem promising." Janet's smile became slightly strained. "Individual stocks can be quite risky, especially for someone just starting out. It's easy to lose money if you don't have experience reading financial statements and understanding market trends. I really think a mutual fund would be more appropriate. But don't some of your clients invest in individual stocks?" "Well, yes, but those are typically clients with larger portfolios and more experience. They can afford to take risks because they have other assets to fall back on." Marcus leaned forward slightly. What if I told you I was willing to take some risks? That I've been studying the market and I understand the potential for losses. Janet's discomfort was becoming more visible, her professional composure cracking slightly around the edges. Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but my job is to protect you from making costly mistakes. A balanced fund will give you steady growth without the volatility of individual stocks. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Janet consistently steering Marcus toward the most conservative, least profitable options available. She recommended a fund with high fees and modest returns, suggested he limit his investment to half his inheritance to maintain liquidity, and provided educational materials that assumed a level of financial ignorance that would have been insulting if directed at any of Pinnacle's typical clients. As the meeting wound down, Marcus asked one final question. What kind of returns could I expect from the investments you're recommending? Janet consulted her materials. Historically, you might see annual returns of 4 to 6%, minus fees. It's not exciting, but it's safe and steady. 4 to 6%. Marcus knew that Janet had recommended portfolios targeting 12 to 15% returns to other clients just that week. The difference wasn't based on market conditions or risk tolerance. It was based on assumptions about what someone like Marcus Johnson could handle, what he deserved, what he was capable of understanding. I'll need to think about it, Marcus said, standing and shaking Janet's hand again. Of course, Janet replied. Take your time, and Mr. Johnson. Don't let anyone pressure you into anything too complicated. Stick with what you can understand. Marcus left the conference room with Janet's business card and a folder full of educational materials about basic investing principles. As he walked back through the lobby, he caught Ashley's eye and nodded his thanks. She smiled and returned to her work, probably already forgetting about the modest black man who'd taken up 30 minutes of the company's time for a $50,000 consultation. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt longer than usual. Each floor marking a descent, not just through the building, but through layers of realization that Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to face. He sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the concrete walls and fluorescent lights while processing what had just happened. This was his company. These were his employees, the policies they followed, the culture they embodied, the assumptions they made. All of it flowed from decisions he had made or allowed to be made. The discrimination he'd just experienced wasn't the work of rogue employees or outdated systems. It was the predictable result of blind spots he'd been too successful, too insulated, too comfortable to see. Marcus drove home through the evening traffic, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. How many potential clients had been turned away or steered towards suboptimal investments because of assumptions about their race, their appearance, their perceived sophistication? How many talented individuals had been overlooked for positions because they didn't fit the unspoken image of what a successful financial advisor should look like? How many times had his company's commitment to diversity been undermined by unconscious biases that operated below the surface of polite professionalism? That night, Marcus sat in his study again, but this time he wasn't alone. Elena had joined him, along with their daughter Zoe, who'd driven down from Colombia for the weekend. Marcus had called her after his meeting with Janet, needing to hear her voice, needing to reconnect with the reason he'd started this investigation in the first place. "So what happens now?" Zoe asked. She was 20 years old, brilliant and idealistic in the way that made Marcus both proud and protective. She'd inherited his analytical mind and Eleanor's fierce sense of justice, a combination that made her formidable in debate and uncompromising in her principles. "Now we figure out how to fix it," Marcus replied. "But first, I need to understand how deep this goes." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus conducted an experiment that would have been impossible for anyone else to attempt. Using his access to company records and his knowledge of internal systems, he created a comprehensive analysis of Pinnacle's client interactions over the previous year. He looked at response times to initial inquiries, the types of investments recommended to different demographic groups, the fee structures applied to various clients, and the success rates of different advisors with different types of customers. The data told a story that was both shocking and entirely predictable. Clients with traditionally white names received callbacks 40% faster than those with traditionally black or Hispanic names. Investment recommendations varied significantly based on perceived race and socioeconomic status, even when controlling for actual assets and stated risk tolerance. Fee structures that were supposedly standardized showed mysterious variations that consistently favored certain demographic groups over others. Most disturbing of all, Marcus discovered that several advisors had developed informal practices for handling what they called community outreach clients, a euphemism for people of color who didn't present obvious signs of wealth. These clients were routinely steered toward the least profitable investment options, charged higher fees for basic services, and scheduled for appointments during off-peak hours when senior staff were less likely to be available. The evidence was overwhelming, but Marcus knew that data alone wouldn't be enough to create change. He needed something more powerful, more personal, something that would force his employees to confront their own biases in a way that mere statistics never could. What happens when someone you trust completely reveals a truth that changes everything you thought you knew about yourself and your world? Share your thoughts in the comments, because the next part of this story will challenge every assumption about justice, redemption, and the courage it takes to face uncomfortable truths. Marcus spent the weekend crafting a plan that was both simple and revolutionary. He would reveal his true identity, but not in the way anyone might expect. Instead of simply announcing who he was and demanding change, he would create a moment of recognition that would force everyone involved to confront their own actions and assumptions. Monday morning arrived with the kind of grey, overcast sky that seemed to match Marcus's mood. He dressed in his best suit, the charcoal grey Armani that Elena had bought him for their anniversary, and drove to the office in his usual car, a understated but expensive sedan that whispered rather than shouted about its owner's success. The Pinnacle building looked the same as always, but Marcus saw it differently now, understanding for the first time how its very design communicated messages about who belonged and who didn't. The marble lobby, the crystal chandeliers, the carefully curated art collection, all of it spoke a language of exclusivity that he'd helped create without fully understanding its implications. Ashley looked up as he approached the reception desk, her professional smile faltering slightly as she tried to place the familiar face in an unexpected context. Marcus could see the moment of recognition dawning in her eyes, followed immediately by confusion and then a growing sense of alarm. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Good morning. I wasn't expecting you today." "Good morning, Ashley. I'd like to speak with Janet Morrison, please. Is she available?" "Of course, sir. Right away." Ashley's fingers trembled slightly as she dialed Janet's extension. "Janet, Mr. Wellington is here to see you." A pause. "Yes, the Mr. Wellington." Another pause. "He's coming to your office now." Marcus walked down the familiar hallway, noting how different it felt when people recognized him, how the energy shifted as word of his presence spread through the office. Doors opened, conversations paused, and the normal rhythm of business stuttered as employees tried to understand why their CEO was making an unscheduled visit. Janet was waiting outside her office, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "this is unexpected. How can I help you?" "I'd like to discuss an investment opportunity," Marcus replied. "Specifically, I'd like to talk about the advice you gave to Marcus Johnson last week." The color drained completely from Janet's face. Marcus watched as understanding crashed over her like a wave, as she realized that the modest black man she'd condescended to was standing before her in a $3,000 suit, revealed as the person who signed her paychecks and determined her future with the company. I don't understand, Janet stammered, though her expression suggested she understood perfectly. "And to conference room 3, Marcus said quietly. "The same room where you recommended that Marcus Johnson limit his investment to $25,000 and stick with a conservative mutual fund because individual stocks would be too risky for someone like him." Janet's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she steadied herself against the doorframe. "Mr. Wellington, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. But first, I'd like you to call Ashley and ask her to join us. And please, ask her to bring the notes from Marcus Johnson's initial visit." The walk to conference room 3 felt like a funeral march. Janet moved like someone in a dream, her professional composure completely shattered. Other employees watched from their offices and cubicles, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Ashley arrived a few minutes later, clutching a file folder and looking like she might be sick. Marcus gestured for both women to sit, then took his place at the head of the small conference table, the same spot where he'd sat as Marcus Johnson while being patronized and dismissed. "I want to start by saying that neither of you is in trouble," Marcus began, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "What happened last week wasn't malicious. It wasn't intentional discrimination, but it was discrimination nonetheless, and it's my fault as much as yours because I created a culture that allowed it to happen." Ashley and Janet exchanged glances, both looking confused and terrified in equal measure. "Ashley," Marcus continued, "when Marcus Johnson first came to our office, what was your initial assessment of him as a potential client?" Ashley's voice was barely above a whisper. I thought he probably wasn't a good fit for our services." "Why?" Because of the amount he wanted to invest. 50,000 isn't really enough for our typical client base." "Is that the only reason?" Ashley was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the table. "No," she said finally. "I made assumptions about him based on how he looked, how he was dressed. I thought he probably didn't understand how our business works." Marcus nodded. "And Janet, when you met with Marcus Johnson, what investment strategy did you recommend?" "A conservative, balanced fund," Janet replied, her voice hollow. "Agree with annual returns of 4 to 6%. And if a white client had come to you with the same $50,000 and the same stated interest in learning about investments, what would you have recommended?" Janet closed her eyes. I would have presented a range of options: growth funds, individual stocks, maybe some international exposure. I would have assumed they could handle more sophisticated investments, even though Marcus Johnson specifically asked about individual stocks and demonstrated knowledge of the market. Yes, the silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the soft tick of the wall clock marking time in a moment that would change everything. "I want you both to understand something," Marcus said finally. "What happened last week happens every day in offices across this country. It happens in banks and law firms and medical practices and real estate agencies. It happens when well-meaning, professional people make assumptions based on appearance rather than ability, when unconscious bias masquerades as business judgment." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where he'd built his fortune and his reputation. "Did I've spent 23 years building this company, and I thought I'd created something different. I thought success would insulate us from the prejudices that shaped my own journey. But success without awareness is just comfortable blindness." Marcus turned back to face Ashley and Janet, both of whom were crying quietly. "The question now is what we do about it. How do we become the company I thought we already were?" Over the next hour, Marcus led a conversation that was part confession, part education, and part planning session. Ashley talked about her own background, growing up in a small town where diversity was limited and assumptions about race and class went unchallenged. Janet shared her recognition that she'd been applying different standards to different clients without even realizing it, operating from unconscious biases that contradicted her conscious values. But Marcus wasn't interested in blame or shame. He was interested in change. Together, the three of them began sketching out a plan for transformation that would go far beyond diversity training or policy updates. They talked about restructuring the client intake process to eliminate bias points, implementing blind review procedures for investment recommendations, and creating accountability measures that would track outcomes rather than just intentions. "Oh, this can't be a one-time conversation," Marcus emphasized. "This has to be an ongoing commitment, a fundamental shift in how we operate." As the meeting concluded, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. "I want to schedule a company-wide meeting for Friday afternoon. I'm going to tell everyone what happened, what I learned, and what we're going to do differently." Ashley looked alarmed. "Sir, are you sure that's wise? It might create legal liability or damage the company's reputation." Marcus smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Today, Ashley, our reputation should be based on how we handle our mistakes, not on pretending we don't make them. And as for legal liability, the biggest risk we face is continuing to operate with systems that discriminate against potential clients." The news of Friday's mandatory meeting spread through the office like wildfire. Rumors flew about layoffs, acquisitions, major policy changes. Marcus let the speculation build, knowing that the reality would be more impactful than anything people were imagining. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made the city look newly minted. The main conference room was packed, with additional staff joining via video conference from satellite offices. Marcus stood at the front of the room, looking out at faces he'd known for years, people he'd hired and promoted and trusted with his vision for the company. "Only 3 weeks ago," he began, "I walked into our lobby dressed in clothes from a thrift store, claiming to be a man named Marcus Johnson who'd inherited $50,000 and wanted investment advice." The room went completely silent. Marcus could see comprehension dawning on various faces, shock and embarrassment and understanding spreading like ripples across a pond. "What I discovered shocked me, not because it was malicious or intentional, but because it revealed blind spots in our company culture that I'd been too successful, too insulated, too comfortable to see." Marcus spent the next 30 minutes walking through his experience, sharing the data he'd compiled, and explaining the systemic changes he planned to implement. He talked about unconscious bias, about the difference between intention and impact, about the responsibility that came with managing other people's financial futures. "I'm not sharing this to embarrass anyone or assign blame," he said, "but I'm sharing it because we can't fix problems we refuse to acknowledge, and we can't serve all of our community if we only see part of it clearly." The questions that followed were thoughtful and sometimes painful. Sarah Chen asked how long these biases had been affecting client outcomes. David Rodriguez wondered whether the company's hiring practices had similar blind spots. Jennifer Walsh raised concerns about how to measure progress and ensure accountability. But the most powerful moment came when Janet Morrison stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "I want to apologize publicly for my role in what happened. Mr. Wellington trusted me to serve all clients with equal professionalism and expertise, and I failed that trust. I failed Marcus Johnson, and I failed the values this company is supposed to represent." Her words opened a floodgate of reflection and commitment. Other employees shared their own experiences with bias, both as perpetrators and victims. The conversation that Marcus had planned for an hour stretched to nearly 3 hours, becoming a cathartic examination of assumptions and prejudices that had operated below the surface for years. As the meeting concluded, Marcus announced the formation of an Equity and Inclusion Task Force, chaired jointly by Janet Morrison and Ashley Thompson. Their first assignment would be to conduct a comprehensive audit of company practices and develop recommendations for systemic change. "This isn't about political correctness or checking boxes," Marcus emphasized. "This is about being the company our clients deserve, the company our employees can be proud of, and the company that truly serves our entire community. The months that followed brought changes that rippled through every aspect of Pinnacle's operations. The client intake process was redesigned to minimize bias points, with initial consultations conducted through structured interviews that focused on financial goals rather than assumptions about sophistication or experience. Investment recommendations were subjected to blind review processes, with senior advisors evaluating proposals without knowing the demographic characteristics of the clients involved. More importantly, the company culture shifted in ways that couldn't be measured by policies or procedures. Employees began having conversations about bias and privilege that had never happened before. Training programs evolved from one-time workshops to ongoing dialogues about serving diverse communities effectively. Client satisfaction scores improved across all demographic groups, but the most significant gains came from communities that had previously been underserved. 6 months after his experiment, Marcus received a letter that made all the difficult conversations and uncomfortable revelations worthwhile. It was from a young Latina woman named Maria Santos, who had visited Pinnacle seeking advice about investing her savings from years of working multiple jobs while putting herself through nursing school. "Dear Mr. Wellington," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for creating a company that saw my potential instead of my limitations. When I first came to your office, I was nervous that I wouldn't be taken seriously because I'm young and don't have a lot of money yet. But Janet Morrison treated me like I was her most important client, explaining different investment options and helping me understand how to build wealth over time. Because of her guidance, I've been able to start investing in my future in ways I never thought possible." Marcus read the letter twice, then called Janet into his office to share it with her. The woman who had once steered Marcus Johnson toward conservative investments because of her assumptions about his capabilities had become one of the company's most effective advocates for inclusive financial planning. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked, as Janet finished reading Maria's letter. "Like redemption," Janet replied, her eyes bright with tears. "Like becoming the advisor I always thought I was, but never actually had been." The transformation at Pinnacle didn't go unnoticed in the broader financial industry. Marcus began speaking at conferences about unconscious bias in wealth management, sharing his story and the lessons his company had learned. Other firms reached out for guidance on implementing similar changes, and Marcus found himself becoming an unlikely advocate for equity in financial services. But the most meaningful validation came from his daughter, Zoe, who called him one evening during her junior year at Columbia. "Dad," she said, her voice filled with pride, "I heard you speak at the diversity conference last week. My roommate's father was there, the same one who made those comments about those people and money. He came up to me afterward and said your presentation changed how he thinks about his own biases. He's implementing changes at his company based on what you shared." Marcus felt something settle in his chest, a weight he'd carried for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. "How does that make you feel?" "Like my father is exactly the man I always believed him to be," Zoe replied. "And there's someone who doesn't just achieve success, but uses it to make the world more fair for everyone." The story of Marcus Wellington's experiment spread beyond the financial industry, becoming a case study in business schools and a reference point for discussions about privilege, bias, and corporate responsibility. But for Marcus himself, the most important outcome was simpler and more personal. He had discovered that true success wasn't measured by the wealth you accumulated or the recognition you received, but by the barriers you broke down and the opportunities you created for others. The black millionaire who pretended to be poor had learned that the most shocking discovery wasn't about other people's prejudices, but about his own power to change them. 2 years later, Pinnacle Financial Services was recognized as one of the most inclusive wealth management firms in the country, with client satisfaction scores that consistently ranked in the top percentile across all demographic groups. The company's success had grown along with its commitment to equity, proving that doing the right thing and doing well in business weren't mutually exclusive goals. Marcus still kept the clothes he'd worn as Marcus Johnson hanging in his office closet, not as a reminder of discrimination faced, but as a symbol of transformation achieved. They served as a daily reminder that the most important journey any leader could take wasn't toward greater success, but toward greater understanding of the responsibility that success carried. On quiet evenings, when the city lights sparkled beyond his office windows and the building hummed with the energy of dreams being built and futures being planned, Marcus would sometimes think about that first elevator ride when he'd stepped into his own company as a stranger and discovered truths that changed everything. The man who had pretended to be poor had found riches beyond anything he'd ever imagined. The wealth that came from knowing that his success was creating opportunities for others, that his company was truly serving its entire community, and that his daughter could be proud not just of what he'd achieved, but of who he'd become in the process. If this story of courage, transformation, and the power of facing uncomfortable truths gave you hope today, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to join a community that believes in the possibility of change, because every story of justice begins with someone brave enough to see the world as it really is, and committed enough to make it better. The most shocking discovery isn't always about what others think of us, but about what we're capable of becoming when we choose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over the easy path.